Have you ever noticed how, when life gets heavy, we start looking for signs? We refresh headlines, read predictions, scroll for answers, anything that feels like a map out of the chaos. It's basically the modern version of staring at the stars and hoping they'll explain what's happening on the ground. That's why Pope Leo XIV's Midnight Mass homily hits so hard. He says the light everyone's craving isn't something you decode from far away. It's something you find up close, so close you have to bend down to see it. And that's where this story really starts. Quick moment, if you love Pope Leo XIV, kindly subscribe, like and share. It guarantees you never miss the next release. Not as a seasonal mood, not as a soft-focused tradition, but as a confrontation dressed in candlelight. Midnight Mass begins, and Pope Leo XIV steps into the moment with a message that doesn't float above the world's pain, it lands inside it. He speaks as if history is not closed, as if the dark is not the final author. He reaches for an ancient promise and treats it like breaking news. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Not a slogan. Not a coping mechanism. A disruption, something newly kindled, something alive. And just when you expect the usual direction, look higher, try harder, climb upward, he delivers the first reversal. If you want to find the Savior, don't search the far horizon. Lower your gaze. The clearest sign to a world running on fear and noise isn't hidden in distant mysteries. It's close enough to kneel beside, a child wrapped in cloth, laid in a manger. No spotlight. No armor. No spectacle, just a newborn's vulnerability announcing a different kind of power. In that single turn, from sky to stable, everything starts to tremble, our definitions of strength, our instincts for control, our excuses for who we leave outside. And to understand why that trembling matters, why this Christmas message feels like the one the world needs now, we have to begin where the story begins, with humanity's long habit of scanning the heavens for hope, and the night that finally forced us to look nearer. So rewind with me, past the carols, past the decorations, back to the oldest scene of all, generations of people staring upward, trying to pull meaning out of silent constellations, hoping the sky would answer what the earth would not. Picture it like a montage that spans centuries in a single breath. A woman on a flat rooftop in an ancient city, wrapped in a coarse shawl, counting the bright points above her as if each one might be a promise. A shepherd on a ridgeline, alone with the cold, watching the sky like it's a door that might open. Sailors on a black sea, reading the heavens the way you read a map when you're lost and pretending you aren't afraid. Scholars hunched over ink and parchment, tracing constellations with a careful hand, convinced that if you name something accurately enough, it will stop haunting you. The stars become language. The sky becomes a library. And human beings, brilliant, imaginative, restless, become interpreters of light. Because down here, the ground is complicated. Down here, truth is not always obvious. Down here, good people suffer, cruel people win, and the line between safe and shattered can be as thin as a phone call in the night. Down here, families can love each other and still wound each other. Nations can promise peace while sharpening knives. A person can have everything on paper and still feel hollow at 3 in the morning. So we do what humans have always done, we look away from the mess that hurts and toward the distance that feels clean. It isn't stupidity. It's survival. If the answer is far enough away, high enough, ancient enough, abstract enough. It doesn't demand anything from us right now. It doesn't ask us to forgive. It doesn't ask us to change. It doesn't ask us to make room. It just asks us to keep watching. And so the world becomes full of oracles. Not only the old ones, smoke and omens and star charts, but the modern ones, too. Forecasts. Feeds. Predictions. The constant hum of what happens next. We trade in information the way earlier generations traded in signs, hoping that if we can see tomorrow clearly enough, today will stop hurting. Yet the strange ache remains. Because the more we try to read the future, the more we realize we can't. The more we demand certainty, the more we feel the edges of our own limits. The human heart, for all its intelligence, can still end up doing something painfully simple. Grasping in the dark. We tell ourselves we're enlightened, but we're often just surrounded by brighter screens. We tell ourselves we're informed, but we're frequently exhausted. We tell ourselves we're connected, but we can still feel alone. And the deeper problem isn't that we lack data. It's that we lack light. Not the kind that comes from a device. Not the kind that floods a room and still doesn't warm it. The kind of light that tells the truth about what we are and still makes hope possible. This is where the story tightens. Because the night we're talking about is not only literal. It's spiritual and moral, too. It's the slow darkening that happens when a world gets used to leaving people out. When convenience becomes sacred. When comfort becomes a fortress. When the poor become a problem, the stranger becomes a threat, and the child becomes an inconvenience. It's the kind of night that doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives one closed door at a time. One ignored person at a time. One not my responsibility at a time. And by the time you notice how cold it is, you're already living inside it. That's what makes the next moment so sharp. Because Christmas, in this telling, is not the sentimental pause we've turned it into. It's not the gentle background music to shopping and nostalgia. It's an interruption. A crack in the pattern. A night when the world's oldest habit, looking upward for a distant answer, gets answered in a way nobody expects. And it begins, fittingly, at midnight. Not noon. Not a convenient hour. Midnight, the hour that feels like the bottom of the day. The hour when the darkness has had time to settle into your bones. The hour when you can't distract yourself with activity anymore and you're left with whatever is real. Midnight Mass begins. Candles tremble. Stone walls hold their breath. The church is gathered, not as an audience looking for entertainment, but as a people who know what it is to hope while still hurting. You can almost feel the weight of the world in the silence, wars carried in the body, grief carried in the eyes, anxieties carried in clenched hands. And then Pope Leo XIV steps forward. Not as a performer. Not as a commentator floating above human life. As a witness standing inside history, speaking into the moment as if the dark is not just an atmosphere but an enemy, real, present, and not to be minimized. His first move is almost startling in its simplicity. He doesn't start with a clever insight. He starts with us. With the human story. For millennia, he reminds the Church, people have gazed up at the sky. They've given names to the stars. They've searched for meaning in the heavens because meaning felt absent below, inside their own homes and cities. They've tried to pull tomorrow out of constellations like a secret. And still, despite all the imagination, despite all the effort, they remained lost. Confounded by their own oracles. That line lands like a diagnosis. Because it doesn't insult humanity, it exposes humanity. It names what we don't like admitting. Even when we become brilliant at interpretation, we can remain blind to what matters most. Even when we become experts in signs, we can miss the sign standing right in front of us. And then he pivots. On this night, he declares, something changes. Not gradually. Not vaguely. Not in a general sense. On this night, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. You can hear the echo of ancient prophecy in the words that have survived empires and exiles and centuries of human disappointment. But the way he speaks them is not archival. It's urgent. It's as if he's saying, this is not a story we tell because it's comforting. This is a reality we proclaim because it's true. And then he gives the image that stuns the room. A star. Not the kind we turn into decoration. Not the kind we reduce to a symbol. A star that astonishes the world, a spark newly lit and blazing with life. The language is vivid, almost dangerous, because it refuses to let Christmas stay harmless. It insists that something has happened, something inserted into time and space. A light has entered history, and history cannot pretend it didn't. And the announcement follows with the blunt force of good news. To you is born this day, in the city of David, a Saviour, who is the Messiah, the Lord. This is where the homily stops being a reflection and becomes a rescue flare. Because the Pope doesn't describe Jesus as a helpful teacher who offers tips for better living. He speaks of him as the one without whom we would not exist, now living among us, illuminating the night with the light of salvation. Not theoretical. Not someday. In our midst. And here's the line that quietly shifts the ground under everything. There is no darkness that this star does not illuminate. It's a promise with teeth. Because if it's true, then the night is not only visible, it's vulnerable. If it's true, then the places we thought were too ruined to be touched might be exactly where the light intends to go. But the Pope doesn't let the room float in poetry for long. Because he knows our reflex. We hear star, and we want to go back to our old habit. We want to return to the safe distance. We want to make the sign into something we observe rather than something we obey. We want to look up. And this is where the first shock arrives, not loud, not theatrical, but precise. The hint of the dawning day is no longer to be sought in the distant reaches of the cosmos, but by bending in the stable nearby. It's a reversal so simple it feels almost humiliating. Because it says, your instinct to search far away is part of the problem. Your habit of keeping salvation at a distance is how you avoid surrender. You want an answer you can admire without changing your posture. But Christmas does not hand you a telescope. It hands you a cradle. The clear sign, the Pope insists, is not hidden behind complex spiritual equations. It's a child, wrapped in bands of cloth, lying in a manger. That's the sign given to a darkened world. A child. Not a throne. Not a weapon. Not a display of force. A newborn whose first strength is helplessness, whose presence demands care, proximity, attention. A God who can be held. A God who can be refused. And then the Pope delivers the instruction that pierces the room like a blade. To find the Saviour, one must not gaze upward, but look below. Look below. Not because the heavens are meaningless, but because the heavens are pointing somewhere you can actually go. Somewhere that requires not analysis but humility. Somewhere that doesn't let you stay a spectator. A stable. Nearby. The kind of place you'd normally avoid. The kind of place you'd normally consider unworthy of God. And that's the point. Because if God enters the world like this, small, exposed, dependent, then every definition of power we've been living by starts to wobble. It's not merely beautiful. It's destabilizing. The world expects thunder, God arrives as breath. The world expects conquest, God arrives needing warmth. The world expects the strong to dominate, God enters history as the one who can be injured. And suddenly Christmas stops being cozy. It becomes a mirror. Because if the sign of salvation is a child with no room, then the question isn't only do you believe. The question becomes uncomfortably practical. Do you make room? In your home. In your priorities. In your economy. In your language. In your heart. Because it's possible to celebrate Christmas and still live like there's no vacancy. It's possible to sing about peace and still build a world that has no space for the fragile, the poor, the inconvenient, the outsider. And that's why Pope Leo XIV's message doesn't feel like a holiday speech. It feels like a warning flare, bright enough to reveal what the dark has been hiding. By the time his opening movement ends, you can sense what he's doing. He's not trying to make you emotional. He's trying to rewire your instincts. He's taking humanity's oldest reflex, look up for distant answers, and forcing it to kneel. Forcing it to come close. Forcing it to see that the light we've begged for is not an abstract concept but a person, present in the most unguarded form imaginable. And if that's true, then the next question isn't whether the story is touching. The next question is whether we're willing to let it change what we worship as His strength. Because once omnipotence is revealed as vulnerability, the whole architecture of domination starts to tremble. And that's where we have to go next, into the heart of the reversal itself, where the night doesn't just get illuminated, it gets confronted. Because once omnipotence is revealed as vulnerability, the whole architecture of domination starts to tremble. Not in theory. In the body. Picture the scene the Pope is forcing the mind to hold, not as a stained glass postcard, not as a sentimental tableau, but as something you could actually step into. A stable is not clean. It smells like animals and damp straw. The air is rough. The edges are sharp. The ground is cold. And in the center of it is not a glowing symbol, not a myth made safe by distance, there is a newborn. Skin flushed and new. Limbs uncoordinated. A tiny chest lifting in quick, shallow breaths. Wrapped in bands of cloth not for decoration, but because infants need to be held together in the world. A baby who cries, not because the world is cruel, but because the body is honest. He cries because he is hungry, because he is cold, because he needs to be touched. He needs warmth. He needs care. He needs someone to respond. And this is where the Pope's homily tightens like a vice. Because he refuses to let you treat that helplessness as a poetic metaphor. He insists it's the point. The eternal Word does not arrive like thunder. He arrives like breath. The one through whom the world was made does not enter history armored. He enters it with soft skin and a fragile throat. The one who holds galaxies does not stride into a palace, he is laid down in a feeding trough. You can feel the confrontation in the contrast. We expect divinity to overwhelm. We expect power to look like control. We expect salvation to arrive with force, with spectacle, with undeniable dominance. Instead, God chooses the only entrance that cannot dominate anyone. A baby cannot conquer. A baby cannot manipulate. A baby cannot threaten. A baby can only receive milk, warmth, shelter, protection. A baby can only be welcomed or refused. And the Pope is saying, that is not a weakness God tolerates. It is a strategy God chooses. Because it exposes something in us. It exposes how addicted we are to a counterfeit power, the kind that must be seen, must be feared, must be obeyed. The kind that proves itself by taking space away from others. The kind that calls itself strength while it crushes what it cannot control. So Christmas arrives like a demolition charge beneath the world's assumptions. It doesn't merely comfort. It interrogates. If God is willing to be small, what does that say about our obsession with being on top? If the Holy One chooses vulnerability, what does that say about how quickly we equate domination with security? If the Lord of History enters as someone who can be harmed, what does that say about the way we treat the harmable? This is where the homily shifts. You can feel the temperature change. Because awe is easy to maintain at a distance. Wonder can remain harmless if it never has to cross into ethics. But Pope Leo XIV refuses to let Christmas remain a museum piece. He turns it toward the door. Toward the town. Toward the world. And he names the uncomfortable truth with brutal clarity. There is no room for God if there is no room for the human person. No room for God if there is no room for the human person. That line is not a flourish. It's a verdict. Because the stable is not only a place in Bethlehem. It's a mirror held up to every society that has learned how to decorate holiness while shutting doors on inconvenient lives. A child turned away. A poor family turned away. A stranger turned away. And the Pope presses the point until it hurts. When we refuse room for the vulnerable, we are not merely failing at kindness. We are refusing God. Suddenly Christmas is not cozy. It is confrontational. You can see what he's doing. He's taking the manger and dragging it into the present tense. Into overcrowded shelters and locked borders. Into neighborhoods where undesirable people are pushed to the margins so comfort can feel uninterrupted. Into economies where human value is calculated like a price tag. Into personal lives where the messy, needy, inconvenient parts of others are treated as interruptions, when they might be invitations. Because the stable has always been about a world that had space for commerce but not for a child. And that pattern hasn't disappeared. It's just gotten better branding. We build what the Pope might call temples of comfort, structures of security and luxury and convenience, then we act shocked when compassion feels expensive. We curate live so tightly that there's no margin left for anyone who might need more than we plan to give. We make peace with systems that discard people, as long as the discarding happens out of sight. And then we light candles at Christmas and call it celebration. The homily will not let you do that. It will not let you sing about no room at the inn as if it's ancient trivia. It insists that no room is a living question. Who has room in your world? Who doesn't? And what does that say about what you worship? At this point, the stable stops being merely humble. It becomes judgment. Not judgment like condemnation for condemnation's sake, but judgment like illumination, like a bright light showing what the dark has been hiding. And then another reversal lands, quiet but devastating. Even a stable can become more sacred than a temple. Think about what that means. A temple is designed for holiness. It's built to impress. It's structured to declare, this is where God belongs. A stable is the opposite, rough, ordinary, disregarded. It's not a place you would choose for anything important. And yet the Pope is saying, holiness is not guaranteed by architecture. Sacredness does not cling to prestige. God does not attach himself to what looks impressive. God attaches himself to love, to humility, to whatever space makes room. So history resets its center. The sacred relocates. Not toward status, but toward surrender. Not toward spectacle, but toward tenderness. Not toward what the world calls important, but toward what the world neglects. And in the heart of that relocation is a woman, Mary, whose womb becomes, in the Pope's imagery, an ark of a new covenant. Not a gilded container behind curtains, but flesh. A human body. A hidden place where God chooses to dwell. That detail matters, because it deepens the confrontation. God does not merely visit humanity. He binds himself to humanity. He enters through the most intimate door imaginable and announces, in the strongest way possible, that human life is not disposable. Which means the question of dignity is not an optional issue. It's at the center of Christmas. And here's where the homily steps on another modern nerve. Because many people, especially exhausted people, want faith to function like a shortcut. A cheat code. A clean solution. A button you press to make the pain stop. But Pope Leo XIV refuses that transaction. He introduces another twist. God does not give a clever solution to every problem. He gives himself. Christmas is not a hack. It's a love story. And love stories aren't efficient. They don't bypass struggle. They don't automate transformation. They require participation. They move slowly, deeply, permanently, or they don't move at all. This directly challenges the way we often treat spirituality now, as a product. A quick fix. Something to use when life is hard. But the Pope is saying, you don't use Christmas. You enter it. You let it reshape you over time. You let faith become a reorientation of the heart, not a tool for managing outcomes. Because God's goal is not to give you a neat life. God's goal is to make you free. And freedom is never instant. It's formed. This is where the homily's moral unease starts to feel sharper, because now the question isn't just what we do to others. It's what we expect from God. Do we want a savior or a solution? Do we want a relationship or control? Do we want to be loved or to remain untouched? And as if that weren't enough, the Pope names the enemy plainly. Not as a vague darkness, not as a poetic cloud, but as something structural, a distorted economy of value where human beings are treated as merchandise. Where worth is tied to usefulness. Where a person is respected only if they produce, perform, conform, or entertain. Where the weak become a burden, and the inconvenient become invisible. You can feel how current this is. How painfully modern it sounds. Because we know this economy. We swim in it. We see it in workplaces that treat people like replaceable parts. In cultures that monetize attention and discard those who can't compete. In systems that reduce the poor to statistics and the unborn to inconvenience and the elderly to expense. In the subtle, everyday ways we evaluate one another. What can you do for me? What do you offer? Are you worth my time? And the Pope's answer is not first of all political. It's incarnational. God's response is not merely to issue a new set of rules from above. God becomes like us. Flesh enters the story, and suddenly flesh is sacred again. Not because flesh is perfect, but because God has inhabited it. Not because human beings are efficient, but because human beings are beloved. In that manger, dignity is restored at the deepest level. The divine doesn't hover above humanity, it unites with humanity. And if that's true, then every person becomes unthrowaway. Every person. Not just the productive ones. Not just the good ones. Not just the ones who fit your tribe. Every person carries a weight that cannot be priced. At this point, the homily is no longer simply explaining Christmas. It's indicting everything that has tried to cheapen human life. And then Pope Leo XIV drives the stake into the heart of the human project with one line that detonates the whole room. While humanity tries to become God in order to dominate others, God becomes man in order to free us from slavery. That is the most dangerous reversal of all. Because it doesn't merely critique bad behavior. It exposes the underlying impulse behind it, the hunger to be like God, not in love, not in holiness, but in control. The impulse to rise above others, to define reality on your terms, to secure your position by diminishing someone else. It's the logic of empires. The logic of egos. The logic of ambition when it turns feral. We see it in history's brutal headlines, and we see it in the quieter rooms of the heart. The desire to win. The need to be right. The instinct to dominate the conversation, the relationship, the outcome. Humanity reaching upward to become divine by stepping on necks. And then, in the middle of that, God does something that shatters the illusion. He comes down. He becomes man. Not to take power, but to give freedom. Not to demand service, but to serve. Not to enslave, but to break chains. This is where the night feels exposed, because suddenly you can't pretend the darkness is only out there. It runs through human instincts, human systems, human fears. And Christmas doesn't deny that. It walks straight into it. In the form of a child. In a stable. With no room. So the chapter ends where the homily leaves you not with a tidy bow, but with a question hanging in the air like a lit fuse. If this is what God is like, if divine power looks like vulnerability, if divine glory sounds like an infant's cry, if divine holiness chooses the discarded places, then what happens to us? What happens to our world? Will this love be enough to change our history? Because now you're awake. And the night, however familiar, however entrenched, no longer feels untouchable. Will this love be enough to change our history? The homily lets the question hang, not because the Pope is uncertain, but because the answer can't be forced into an argument. It can't be delivered like a statistic or proven like a theorem. It has to be awakened. Because Christmas doesn't win by debate. It wins by presence. So Pope Leo XIV does something disarmingly simple. He brings you back to the stable, not as a concept, but as a place you can almost feel under your feet. He makes you walk the last few steps of the story with the shepherds, those unlikely first witnesses who weren't chosen for their influence, their education, or their respectability. They were chosen because they were awake in the night. Picture them out in the open fields where the wind has teeth. The kind of darkness that makes sound travel farther. The kind of cold that keeps you alert because sleep feels like surrender. They're doing what shepherds do, watching, waiting, guarding life that cannot guard itself. And then the sky splits open, not into fortune-telling signs, not into a new system of omens, but into announcement. An angel. A message. A fear that hits the body before the mind can interpret it. And then the directive that changes everything, go. Not understand. Not calculate. Not debate. Go. The Pope's voice, even across centuries, keeps that momentum alive. Because the shepherds don't receive the message as content, they receive it as a summons. They move. They leave the fields. They leave what's familiar. They walk toward a place they would never have chosen on their own, a stable, a feeding trough, an unremarkable corner of town. And the closer they get, the more the night seems to hold its breath. This is the hinge of the story. Revelation becomes an encounter. When they arrive, what they find is not a polished scene. It's people. Mary and Joseph are there, not as untouchable icons, but as two human beings who have been pushed to the margins and somehow are still standing. You can imagine the fatigue in their shoulders, the alertness in their eyes. The hush that follows a birth. The way the world changes shape when a child arrives and everything suddenly feels both fragile and sacred. Joseph is not triumphant. He is protective. Mary is not performing holiness. She is holding life. And at the center is the child. Not symbolic. Not decorative. Fragile and absolute. A newborn doesn't fill a room with speeches. He fills it with need. With breath. With the quiet insistence of life that cannot be ignored. His hands are small. His skin is new. His power is not displayed, it is hidden inside the fact that he is here at all. God, in the form of a baby, is not an idea you admire. He is a presence you either welcome or refuse. And this is where the homily reaches its primary climax, not in volume, but in clarity. The Pope describes it like waking from a deadly night into something you didn't know was possible. Like stepping out of a long season where darkness felt normal and realizing you had been living under a lie. Because the stable doesn't offer a trick. It offers a person. And suddenly the question, will this love be enough, is answered the way Christmas always answers, not with explanation, but with light. Not the harsh light of interrogation, but the steady light of a dawn that doesn't ask permission. The sky transforms. Not into a horoscope. Not into a cosmic puzzle. Not into distant symbols you can interpret without changing. It becomes a choir. The heavenly host, unarmed, unstoppable, singing glory to God. And the glory they proclaim is not domination. It is peace. That detail matters more than most people realize. Because peace is not impressive in the way violence is impressive. Peace doesn't go viral like outrage. Peace doesn't seize territory. Peace doesn't show up with banners and drums. Peace shows up and tells the truth. You are not made to devour each other. And in the Pope's telling, peace isn't merely the absence of conflict. It is the presence of God's order, God's love, God's refusal to let darkness be the final script. This peace is disarming. And that's why it scares violence. Because violence can be negotiated with. It can be bribed. It can be threatened. It can be mirrored. But real peace? Peace can't be bought. It can't be controlled. It can't be leveraged. You can't manipulate it the way you manipulate fear. And that's why the stable is more dangerous than a palace. Because what begins there cannot be managed by the usual tools of history. It doesn't rise through conquest. It rises through communion. Here is the quiet victory. No armies. No spectacle. No conquest. Just a child whose existence exposes the emptiness of every empire built on force. The Pope's homily makes the contrast unavoidable. History has always called victory the moment someone wins at someone else's expense. The moment a stronger hand closes around a weaker throat. The moment a flag rises because another one fell. But Christmas reveals a different victory, one that doesn't require anyone to be crushed. A victory that looks like humility. A victory that looks like mercy. A victory that looks like God refusing to become what we expect, because what we expect is often what keeps us enslaved. And that's the turning point. The night is real, but it is no longer sovereign. The darkness still exists. People still suffer. Doors still close. Systems still grind. Fear still whispers. But the darkness no longer owns the future. Because the future has a face now. And then, just when the listener might want to stay there, just when you might want to linger in that stable as if it's a safe refuge from the world, the Pope pivots. Sharply. Purposefully. He refuses to let the story end in admiration. Because Christmas is not meant to be observed like a display. It's meant to be carried. So the homily shifts from contemplation to command, and the tone changes from behold to go. As the Jubilee draws toward its close, Pope Leo XIV frames Christmas as gratitude and mission, gift received, witness required. Not gratitude as a warm feeling. gratitude as a force that moves you. Because if God has given himself, if the child in the manger is truly Emmanuel, God with us, then you don't simply say thank you and return to life as usual. You become the kind of person who tells the truth about what you've seen. The church is not invited to admire Christmas. It is sent. Tell of his salvation from day to day. Day to day. Not once a year. Not only in song. Not only in sanctuaries. Day to day means grocery lines and commutes and kitchens. It means offices, hospitals, and classrooms. It means the places where people are tired, forgotten, angry, lonely. It means the ordinary spaces where darkness often hides behind normal routines. Christmas becomes a movement. And to make that movement concrete, the Pope names the three engines that drive it, not as abstract ideals, but as the inner machinery of a life that refuses to surrender tonight. Faith. Because God becomes man. Faith is not denial. It's not optimism with religious vocabulary. It's the decision to trust that the story is true, that God has entered time and therefore time can be redeemed. Faith is the courage to live as if the manger changes the meaning of everything, because it does. Charity. Because the redeeming gift is realized in fraternal self-giving. Charity is love made practical. Love that costs something. Love that creates room where there was none. Love that stops treating people as merchandise and starts treating them as mysteries, bearers of dignity, not tools for use. In other words, charity is what Christmas looks like when it leaves the stable and enters the street. Hope. Because the child kindles it within us, making us messengers of peace. Hope is not naivete. Hope is not pretending the night isn't dark. Hope is standing inside the darkness and refusing to call it final. Hope is the decision to keep a lamp lit even when the wind is brutal, because you believe dawn is real. And in the Pope's vision, these virtues don't stay inside the heart like private comforts. They are equipped. They mobilize. They turn believers into messengers of peace, people who carry a disarming, unpurchasable calm into chaotic rooms. People who make space for the neglected. People who speak dignity where the world speaks discard. People who can walk into darkness without being owned by it. Not because they are fearless, but because they are anchored. This is the final image the homily offers, and it's as cinematic as it is demanding. The believer steps forward into the world, unafraid of the night, not because the night is imaginary, but because the light has already entered it. The stable is not a museum. It is a launch point. History continues. Conflicts remain. Pain persists. But the story no longer belongs to darkness. Because somewhere in the middle of the night, a child was born. And once that happens, the dawn does not ask permission to rise. Christmas ends with motion. The night is not denied, but it is no longer final. Before you go, subscribe, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and share your thoughts.